Professional wrestling is scripted. Everybody knows that. But here's what most people don't think about. The person across the ring from you is still very real, and some of those people genuinely terrified their coworkers. Not because of their characters, but because of who they actually were. The fear wasn't always about fists, either. Sometimes the most dreaded guy in the locker room was the one carrying a notebook, Randy Savage. Fear in wrestling isn't always about getting punched in the face. Sometimes the scariest guy in the locker room is the one who makes you absolutely terrified of disappointing him. And nobody embodied that better than Randy Savage. See, most fans remember Savage for the cream of the crop promos, the Slim Jim ads, the sunglasses, the voice, but the wrestlers who actually had to work with him, they remember something completely different. They remember a man who would hand you dozens of pages of handwritten notes before a match and expect you to memorize every single transition. We're talking full notebooks, handwritten, color-coded in some cases. In an era where most guys just called it in the ring, improvising spots based on crowd reactions, Savage was operating like a film director on a Hollywood set. Every arm drag, every counter, every near fall, all scripted, all drilled, all expected to be executed exactly as planned. You didn't get creative input. You got instructions. The defining example is WrestleMania 3, March 29, 1987, Pontiac, Michigan. Savage versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. That match lasted just under 15 minutes, but contained a remarkably dense series of moves and counters that still gets studied today. It's widely celebrated as one of the greatest matches in WWE history. People break it down frame by frame in training seminars, but here's the thing nobody mentions when they're praising it. Savage constructed that entire match on paper beforehand. Dozens of individual transitions, all mapped out, all rehearsed repeatedly. Steamboat himself later talked about the mental strain of memorizing the entire sequence. Not the physical strain, the mental strain. That tells you everything you need to know about what it was like to be Randy Savage's opponent. And that's exactly where the fear came from. Stepping into the ring with Randy Savage meant entering his fully designed world. You weren't a creative collaborator. You were a performer executing his vision. Any deviation from the pre-planned match felt like a betrayal of his trust. And the worst part? He remembered. Every misstep, every blown spot, every moment where you went off script, it was logged somewhere in that brain of his. Normal performance anxiety gets cranked up to something closer to genuine dread when you know your opponent is keeping a mental scorecard and has zero intention of ever losing that scorecard. But the fear wasn't limited to bell to bell. Savage was extremely protective of his personal life, particularly his then-wife and on-screen manager, Miss Elizabeth. Colleagues have talked about how even routine backstage interactions carried an invisible minefield quality. A casual conversation that lasted a beat too long. Eye contact that lingered half a second past comfortable. You could inadvertently trip a personal boundary you didn't even know existed, and suddenly you've got friction with one of the top guys in the company. Not because you did anything wrong, but because Savage's radar was always on, and his radar was military grade. Now, the easy narrative is to call him paranoid, and plenty of people have, but there's a popular counter-argument in the fan community that deserves attention. The people pointing fingers at Savage and calling him irrational were often the same people creating the chaotic backstage environment he was trying to protect himself from. Gossip, power plays, locker room politics, all of it swirling around constantly. When you look at it that way, his guarded behavior starts to look less like pathology and more like a rational defense mechanism. He wasn't paranoid, he was paying attention, which is, not ideal for the people who were hoping he wasn't. Here's what makes Savage unique on this list. He wasn't feared because he was reckless. He wasn't feared because he threw stiff shots or cornered guys in hallways. He was feared because he cared too much. The irony is that his obsession with perfection produced some of the greatest matches ever wrestled. But it also meant that sharing a ring with him felt less like a collaboration and more like an audition for your entire career. Every single time. No off nights, no easy Tuesdays. Just the constant awareness that Randy Savage expected excellence and had a very long memory for anything less. But if Savage made you fear disappointing him, the next guy on this list made you fear for your actual physical safety. Big Van. Vader. Randy Savage made you afraid of failing. Vader made you afraid of the hospital. And honestly, the hospital might have been the better option some nights. Leon Allen White was billed at around 400 pounds, which normally puts you in the stands in the corner and absorbs punishment category of professional wrestling. But Vader didn't get that memo. This man moved like someone half his size. He could moonsault, he could do dropkicks, he could launch himself off the top rope with a level of commitment that made ringside physicians visibly nervous. He was 400 pounds of agility crammed into a frame that had zero business being that athletic, and the result was one of the most genuinely dangerous human beings to ever lace up a pair of boots. Because here's the thing about Vader. He didn't just look like he could hurt you. He actually hurt you. Vader was what the industry calls a stiff worker, which is a polite way of saying his punches weren't pretend. His forearms weren't pretend. His splashes from the top rope onto your ribcage were absolutely, categorically not pretend. When Vader hit you, you felt it the next morning, and sometimes the morning after that. And sometimes on the following Tuesday when you sneezed wrong and your entire torso reminded you of what happened. Jim Cornette has talked openly about Vader's stiffness with major stars, and the key detail there is major stars. This wasn't a guy who only roughed up the newcomers. Established main eventers, people who had been in the business for decades, felt his offense in the most literal sense possible. Nobody was exempt. If you were in the ring with Vader, you were accepting a certain amount of legitimate physical trauma as the cost of doing business. But the real horror stories are what set Vader apart from just being a guy who hits hard. During a match against Stan Hansen in Japan, Hansen caught Vader with a strike so stiff it reportedly dislodged Vader's eye from its socket, just popped it right out. And what did Vader do? He pushed the eyeball back in and finished the match, which is, not ideal, but it tells you everything about the world Vader operated in. This was a man whose response to his own eye leaving his skull was mild annoyance. Most people would be screaming for an ambulance. Vader was screaming at the referee because the match wasn't over yet. Now, if that was the only story, you could write it off as a freak accident in an exceptionally physical match. But it wasn't the only story, not even close. On March 16, 1994, Mick Foley, wrestling as Cactus Jack, lost part of his ear during a match with Vader in Germany. A planned spot involving Foley's head getting tangled between the ring ropes went wrong, and the ear just tore off. Brutal. Graphic. The kind of thing that makes you instinctively touch your own ear while reading about it. But here's where it gets really important. Foley didn't frame this as some isolated freak accident. He described a broader history of very rough matches with Vader. The ear wasn't the exception. It was the extreme end of an ongoing pattern. When a man whose entire brand is absorbing inhuman punishment tells you that someone was consistently too rough, you should probably listen. That's like a fire station calling the fire department. And the unpredictability made everything worse. Some nights Vader worked safely, controlled, professional. Other nights, he turned the intensity up to a level that genuinely shocked opponents and agents alike. You never knew which Vader you were getting. Imagine walking through the curtain knowing that the 400-pound man waiting for you might decide tonight's the night he stops pulling his punches. That uncertainty, that complete inability to predict how much pain you were about to be in, is what separated Vader from other big men. It wasn't just that he could hurt you, it was that you had no idea if he would. Every match was a coin flip between firm but fair and I hope your insurance is current. The beautiful irony in all of this? Vader himself once admitted in an interview that there was one giant he feared and avoided for years. Even the monster had a monster. Fear in professional wrestling isn't a single tier. It's a food chain, and everybody's looking over their shoulder at somebody. But if you think raw physical danger is the scariest thing a wrestler can bring to the table, wait until you meet the man who combined it with something far worse. Authority, The Undertaker. Every wrestler we've talked about so far was scary because of what they might do to your body. The Undertaker was scary because of what he might do to your career. Mark Calloway debuted at Survivor Series 1990 and immediately became something professional wrestling had never really seen before. Not just a big guy, not just a character, a presence. Over the next 3 decades, he built an aura so thick that wrestlers didn't describe facing him as a match. They described it as confronting something unavoidable. Like Destiny had booked a table for 2 and you were sitting down whether you wanted to or not. And that WrestleMania streak, the undefeated streak that stretched across more than 2 decades of the biggest show in wrestling. Every single year, somebody had to walk down that ramp knowing they were almost certainly going to lose. But they had to make it look like they had a chance. One bad performance in that spot, and your reputation takes a hit that might never recover. But a great one? That could define your entire career. But here's the thing. The in-ring stuff, the streak, the choke slams, the tombstone pile drivers, that was only half the equation. Maybe less than half. Because behind the curtain, The Undertaker held a position of power that most casual fans have zero idea existed. It was called Wrestler's Court. This was an actual informal tribunal held in the locker room where wrestlers who violated unwritten backstage codes would be brought before their peers. Showing up late, disrespecting veterans, being sloppy. Whatever the offense, you'd find yourself standing in front of the locker room while your colleagues decided your fate. And sitting at the center of it all, acting as judge, jury, and occasionally executioner of your dignity, was The Undertaker. The punishments themselves were often almost comically mild. In one widely discussed case, a wrestler was sentenced to wash the APA's rental car, go outside, get some soap, wash Bradshaw and Farouk's car, something you'd ask your teenager to do on a Saturday, but nobody was laughing. The Undertaker's presence alone transformed that car wash into a solemn act of penance. The punishment wasn't the point. The ritual was. Being dragged in front of your coworkers, judged by a man who could end your push with a single conversation with management, and then being made to perform some menial task with complete humility. That was the fear, not the bucket and sponge. The understanding that you had been weighed, measured, and found wanting by the one person nobody wanted to disappoint. And this is what made his fear factor completely different from someone like Vader. Vader would hurt your body. Undertaker could hurt your standing. Wrestlers weren't worried about taking a stiff shot. They were worried about crossing an invisible political line they didn't even know existed. They were worried about being the guy whose name came up in wrestler's court next week. The man also almost never broke character in public. For decades, he maintained kayfabe with a discipline that bordered on religious devotion. No out-of-character interviews. No jokes on camera. He was the Undertaker at all times, which meant that even backstage, people weren't entirely sure where the character ended and the man began. When he did finally break kayfabe publicly, it was treated as a genuinely significant event. Not because the information was shocking, but because him dropping the veil at all was shocking. He wasn't protecting a gimmick, he was protecting the business itself. That custodianship elevated everything around him. Matches with The Undertaker weren't just matches, they were narrative milestones carrying the weight of decades of mythology. If you were booked to face him, you weren't just working a Tuesday. You were stepping into a legacy. A poorly executed bout could damage your credibility in ways that took years to repair. And actually, beating him? That required the company to trust you on a level reserved for maybe 5 people in the entire history of the promotion. So, when wrestlers say they feared The Undertaker, they're not talking about getting hit. They're talking about the gavel, the quiet authority, the sense that one wrong move, one lapse in professionalism, one match that didn't meet the standard, and you'd find yourself on the wrong side of the most respected man in the building. That's institutional fear. And honestly, it might be the most effective kind. But if you think institutional authority is scary, wait until you meet the guy who could legitimately take anyone in that locker room to the ground and make them tap because he already proved it at the Olympics. With a broken neck, Kurt Angle. Most wrestlers on the WWE roster are pretending to be fighters. Kurt Angle actually is one, and everyone in that locker room knew it. Here's the thing about Angle. Every other person on this list earned their fear factor inside the wrestling business. Angle walked in the door with his already built. The man won an Olympic gold medal in freestyle wrestling at the 1996 Atlanta Games. That alone puts him in rare air. But the way he won it is what turns a great athletic achievement into one of the most insane stories in the entire history of sports. During the US national trials, doctors discovered that Angle had a broken neck. Not a stiff neck, not a sore neck, a broken neck. 3 discs were protruding directly into his spinal cord. Most people with that diagnosis are being told not to sneeze too hard. Kurt Angle looked at that information and said, "Yeah, I'm still going to the Olympics." And then he went, and then he won gold. Which is, not ideal for anyone who ever had to share a ring with him because it established something very clearly from day one. This man's relationship with pain is not normal. Angle made his televised WWE debut in 1999, and what happened next was almost unfair to the rest of the roster. He developed a hybrid style that blended legitimate amateur wrestling technique with professional wrestling storytelling, and at the center of it was the ankle lock. Now, most finishing moves in wrestling are about theatrics. The ankle lock is different. WWE actually released demonstration footage of Angle applying the hold to practice partners, and the results are genuinely uncomfortable to watch. The training partner taps out almost immediately, not selling, not performing, frantically tapping because Angle is casually applying real rotational pressure to ligaments and tendons while looking like he's barely trying. That's not a wrestling move being demonstrated. That's a submission hold being proven. And this is where the fear gets existential. Every single person on that roster understood a very simple equation. If a match ever went sideways, if things ever slipped from performance into reality, even for a moment, Kurt Angle would win. Not might win, would win. There's no amount of gym muscle or tough guy attitude that overcomes an Olympic gold medalist who has decided to make something hurt. That knowledge sat in the back of every opponent's mind every single time they stepped through those ropes with him. But if you need proof that this wasn't just theoretical, there's one story that settles the debate permanently. Backstage, Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar got into a shoot wrestling contest. A real one. No script, no cooperation, no predetermined outcome. Just 2 elite athletes grappling for real. Now, Brock Lesnar at the time was arguably the most physically intimidating human being in WWE. A former NCAA Division I wrestling champion himself, built like someone tried to create a final boss in a laboratory. On paper, you'd think Lesnar would at least make it competitive. Angle won comfortably, not barely, not by a hair, comfortably. As recounted by Dutch Mantel, Angle's technical superiority was so pronounced that Lesnar's size advantage simply didn't matter. Think about what that means for every other wrestler on the roster. If Brock Lesnar can't handle Kurt Angle in a real contest, what chance does anyone else have? The answer is 0, and everybody knew it. That's the unique terror of being in the ring with Kurt Angle. With most wrestlers, the performance is the performance. The moves are cooperative. Everyone goes home. But with Angle, the line between what's real and what's show was thinner than it was with almost anyone else in the business. His submissions carried genuine mechanical danger. His takedowns were rooted in thousands of hours of real competitive drilling. And if he decided to apply his ankle lock with actual intent, you weren't getting out of it. You were tapping, or something in your ankle was going to stop working correctly. The broken neck narrative made it even worse, because it told his colleagues something about his psychology that went beyond physical skill. This is a man who competed at the highest level of athletic competition on the planet with 3 discs pressing into his spinal cord. That level of pain tolerance implicitly pressured everyone around him. How do you tell Kurt Angle you need a night off for a sore shoulder? How do you slow down a match when the guy across from you won Olympic gold while his spine was actively trying to paralyze him? You don't. You match his intensity, or you risk looking comparatively soft. And nobody wanted that comparison following them around. Every other wrestler on this list made people afraid through aggression, authority, or unpredictability. Angle made people afraid through competence. Pure, undeniable, Olympic caliber competence. He didn't need to throw his weight around backstage. He just needed to exist in that locker room as the one guy who didn't need any of this to be fake. And that was enough. But if you think an Olympic gold medalist is scary, wait until you hear about the man he beat in that shoot wrestling contest, because Brock Lesnar built an entirely different kind of fear. Brock Lesnar? Every wrestler on this list made people afraid for different reasons. Vader could hurt you with his hands. Savage could break you with his expectations. Undertaker could end your push with a glance. Angle could tie you into a pretzel if he felt like it. Brock Lesnar is what happens when you combine all of that into one 285-pound human being and then give him a UFC heavyweight championship just to make things worse. Lesnar debuted on WWE television in 2002, and within months, he was WWE champion. Not years, months. They called him the next big thing, which sounds like corporate marketing until you realize it was actually an understatement. He was an NCAA Division I heavyweight wrestling champion with the frame of a refrigerator and the speed of someone half his size. Watching him move for the first time was genuinely confusing. People that big are not supposed to be that fast. It felt like a glitch in the physics engine. But here's the thing about Lesnar that separates him from every other big scary wrestler in history. Most guys who are that physically imposing are entertainers first. They learned to work, they came through the system. Lesnar came through the system too, but he also went and became UFC heavyweight champion. That's not a wrestling accolade. That's a real fighting accolade. So when wrestlers stepped into the ring with him after that, they weren't thinking about selling his moves convincingly. They were thinking about the fact that this man's punches have knocked out professional fighters who train specifically to not get knocked out, which is, not ideal when your job requires you to stand still and let him hit you. The incident that became shorthand for everything people feared about working with Lesnar was the Hardcore Holly match. During a powerbomb, Holly came down badly and broke his neck. The debate has never been fully settled. Some say Holly sandbagged the move, others say Lesnar misjudged the execution. And the honest answer is that it probably doesn't matter which version you believe, because even in the most generous interpretation, where 0% of the blame falls on Lesnar, the result of a miscommunication during one of his moves was a catastrophic spinal injury. Now, imagine being the next guy on the schedule. Hey, you're working with Brock on Sunday. Have fun out there. Great, add that to the list. What makes the fear around Lesnar unique is the scale of everything. He's not just big, he's an NCAA champion. He's not just tough, he's a UFC heavyweight champion. He's not just stiff, he broke a man's neck. Every category of danger that exists in professional wrestling, Lesnar maxes out. A suplex delivered even slightly off axis by someone with his explosive strength can result in an opponent landing directly on their head. The margin for error with most wrestlers is small. The margin for error with Brock Lesnar is basically non-existent. And then there's the shoot wrestling story with Kurt Angle. Angle reportedly won that legitimate grappling contest, and if you remember the Angle section of this video, you know how dangerous that man is on the mat. But here's the kicker. The fact that beating Lesnar was considered noteworthy, even when it was an Olympic gold medalist doing the beating, tells you everything. Losing a real wrestling match to Kurt Angle doesn't make you look weak. It means you were considered a serious enough threat that one of the greatest amateur wrestlers in history felt the need to test you. That's not a loss. That's a terrifying compliment. Now, there's a side of Lesnar that complicates the pure monster image. In interviews, he's talked about his early days with surprising humility. He said he was never scared to ask a stupid question. that he didn't care if the answer was no, he just wanted to know. That's not the mentality of a reckless wrecking ball. That's someone who understood the craft well enough to seek out knowledge. And honestly, that makes the whole thing scarier in a different way, because it means Lesnar wasn't dangerous due to ignorance. He was dangerous because even with all that professionalism, his physical tools were so extreme that normal safety margins simply didn't apply to him. His part-time status in later years only amplified this. When you work with someone every week on house shows, you develop a rhythm. You learn their timing, their tendencies. With Lesnar, there were no house shows, no warm-up matches. You got him on pay-per-view, in front of millions of people, and you had to trust that the choreography would hold up against the most physically explosive performer in the company without the benefit of reps. There was no easing into things. Lesnar represents the ultimate version of what every wrestler on this list embodies in parts. The physical danger of Vader, the legitimate credentials of Angle, the aura of Undertaker, the high-pressure environment of Savage. But with Lesnar, it all exists simultaneously, at maximum volume, inside one person whose real fighting ability makes the predetermined nature of wrestling feel less like a guarantee and more like a polite suggestion. The match is scripted, sure, but the man executing the moves could end a fight for real if he wanted to, and everyone in that locker room knew it. That's Brock Lesnar. That's why he's last on this list, and that's why nobody wanted to be first on his. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.